Carlos, we have a little bit of a bittersweet moment because we've come to the end of this series of When Katty Met Carlos. It's the last in the series, and we will be back at the end of the summer. But for the moment, we are taking a pause.
Indeed we do. I still remember us discovering our mutual love of Casablanca and realizing that this was indeed the beginning of a beautiful friendship.
And I think When Harry Met Sally was both of our second favorite films too, hence the name of the show.
It was. What a wonderful and unexpected run we've had here together. It's been great.
It's been a treat. I can't believe we've done 30 episodes. Where has the time gone? But we've had such interesting conversations. I remember right in the beginning speaking, to Jeff Flake and Helene Cooper about whether America had been humbled by the pandemic. And then we spoke to Justice Malala, a South African commentator, about race in America. We had that wonderful conversation with Atul Gawande last week on dying and death and grief. We've touched so many areas of American life, America that is changing as we are speaking.
I mean, Katty, think about how different the America that we live in today is here in April versus the one that you and I originally started chatting about. So yes, the world is moving quickly, and I feel like we've been lucky to have some of these conversations about everything from conspiracy theories to Gen Z and back.
Yeah, and to be able to step back a little bit from what has been a very tumultuous news period and examine these underlying big shifts that are happening in the country. And I don't think it's over. You keep saying this to me, Carlos, and the more you say it and the more we talk to people, the more I realize how right you are, that we are entering a period in America of change, of big, exciting, tumultuous, perhaps uncomfortable change. But change it surely is. And what a great time to have a way to talk about it.
Yeah, I have felt like this has been the ultimate treat to be here with you on this. And now we look ahead not only at what Biden has done his last 100 days, but what maybe he could do in the days ahead.
And we will be back late in the summer to talk about it all.
We will. As Nixon once famously said, tan, rested, and ready.
I love that. I'm hoping so.
Indeed.
Hello, I'm Katty Kay in Washington.
And I'm Carlos Watson in California.
Welcome to When Katty Met Carlos,
a new podcast exploring what's shaping America today, brought to you by the BBC World Service and OZY Media. Since the presidency of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, it's become a tradition of American politics to assess the performance of a new president after their first 100 days in office. During a similar period, President Roosevelt pushed through 15 pieces of major legislation, forming the foundation of the New Deal, an effort to lift the U.S. out of the Great Depression. President Biden, too, has found himself taking office during a time of crisis, the COVID-19 pandemic, widespread racial justice protests, political polarization, and a climate crisis, just to name a few.
Former President Trump used to refer to his competitor as Sleepy Joe. And yes, it has been quieter in Washington since he's taken office. There are no midnight tweets from him. But so far, it would be hard to conclude that the Biden-Harris administration has appeared tired. In his first 3 days in office, President Biden signed 30 executive orders and actions, many overturning his predecessor's policies. And he's got his $1.9 trillion American Rescue Plan through Congress. It's been a busy 3 months.
I, Joseph Robinette Biden, Jr., do solemnly swear
that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States.
Office of President of the United States.
Congratulations, Mr. President.
And I pledge this to you. I will be a president for all Americans. As we've indicated earlier, we're going to be signing a number of executive orders over the next several days to week. And the first order I'm going to be signing here relates to COVID.
Today, President Biden is continuing his commitment to embedding equity at the center of his agenda. The president has declared a major disaster in 77 Texas counties as residents continue to struggle in the aftermath of a deadly winter storm.
A growing crisis is unfolding at the U.S.-Mexico border as we learn many of those crossing are young children.
As of yesterday, more than 100 million payments of $1,400 have gone into people's bank accounts. U.S. troops, as well as forces deployed by our NATO allies and operational partners, will be out of Afghanistan before we mark the 20th anniversary of that heinous attack on September 11th.
We are all a part of George Floyd's legacy, and our job now is to honor it and to honor him.
We did it. 200 million shots in 100 days.
He campaigned to get the country back on track, and it's certainly been a bold start. With 2 more major bills on their way, the ambition of the Biden administration has surprised even some within his own party. The policy appears to be to underpromise and overdeliver. As with the vaccine rollout, where the country sailed past his original target, and now more than 230 million doses have been given. But with the midterms on the horizon in 2022, the administration doesn't have long before its first major electoral challenge.
We'll be hearing from a Republican voice later, but first, to look back on the first 3 months with us is Beto O'Rourke, the former Democratic congressman from El Paso, Texas. In 2018, he captured national attention when he ran a hard-fought campaign to unseat Senator Ted Cruz in the deeply Republican state. In 2019, O'Rourke ran for president, competing for the Democratic nomination, but he dropped out and he later backed Joe Biden. Beto O'Rourke, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. It's good to be with you.
Thank you. When you campaigned for the Democratic nomination, you said that the Democratic Party needed bold, new ideas, and you felt that Joe Biden wouldn't bring those. 3 months in, do you still think that Biden is a return to the past?
I think President Biden is precisely the person that we need at this moment. We're confronting the greatest set of challenges I think that this country has ever known. Most importantly among them, this climate crisis, but that also includes the pandemic, the worst in the last 100 years, the recession that followed the pandemic, the worst since the Great Depression, and a host of other challenges, not the least of which is a very concerted attack on democracy itself. There are more than 300 voter suppression bills pending in over 47 state legislatures. And on the eve of President Biden's inauguration, you literally had a storming of the United States Capitol, the first successful invasion of our seat of democracy since the War of 1812. Against those challenges, I think he's doing extraordinarily well in just these first 100 days. So, yes, he surprised a lot of us, especially those of us who were running in that Democratic primary. I mean, many of us probably wouldn't have gotten into that primary if we knew that Joe Biden would be the kind of president that he has shown himself to be so far.
Beto, as you look at where Texas is today, not only in relation to Biden, but where Texas was on behalf of President Trump, Texas voted for President Trump, how do you think Texas is receiving Biden, and what does that say to you about where the country is more broadly?
I'll tell you, there's a lot of gratitude in this state for President Biden. In the wake of a terrible winter storm and then a man-made power outage that cost the lives of more than 200 of our fellow Texans, the Biden administration came to the rescue of Texas and made sure that whether you lived in a big city or a rural county, they were there to help. In the face of more than 50,000 dead from COVID in this state, his effort and singular focus on getting vaccines into the arms of our fellow Americans has transformed this state and what is possible for us, certainly in terms of healthcare outcomes, but that's related to our ability to overcome the recession, to find jobs, and to get this economy going again. So he's made a very positive impression on this state. And we recently got census information that shows that Texas will pick up 2 new congressional seats, which brings our electoral college total to 40 electoral college votes. That will clearly make Texas the biggest battleground state in the country. And I think these signal successes in Texas bode well for his chances in 2024 and for Democrats at all levels of the ballot.
And Beto, let me push on that if I can, because to your point, we did see breakthroughs in unexpected battleground states like Georgia and Arizona in the last election, where Biden and Democrats outperformed versus expectation. But we didn't see it in Texas. What does that tell you that it didn't happen? Because I know how hard you were working to try to make that happen.
We got a lot closer. Joe Biden performed better than Hillary Clinton did in 2016, who performed better than Barack Obama had done in 2012. So we're seeing strong signs of progress. But we should remember, when we look at Georgia, for example, that was a 10-year project. And it involved the kind of painstaking, tough work of being at people's doors and persuading them not so much to vote for Democrats, but in a very heavily voter-suppressed state to vote at all. And that's something that we definitely learned from Stacey Abrams and Nsé Ufot and others who led that grassroots effort in Georgia. Something very similar is taking place in Texas. But we should remember, it's a much larger state. On the first day of early voting in 2020, for example, the same number of people voted in Harris County, home to Houston, Texas, as voted in the entire state of Georgia. There are 254 counties here for us to work through. And then there's this, Carlos. This is the hardest state, bar none, in which to vote. There's no online voter registration. There have been 750 polling place closures, twice as many as the closest state, and mostly concentrated in the fastest growing Black and brown neighborhoods. You have what a 3-judge federal panel described as a racial gerrymander of our political jurisdictional lines, and you have the most onerous voter ID laws in the country. The Election Law Journal has ranked Texas dead last 50th in ease of voting. There's some real consequences to that. 7 million age-eligible Texans did not vote in 2020. So it means that we have to work a lot harder. It means that we have to stop current voter suppression efforts in the state legislature. But it also means that we need some federal help. And we are looking to President Biden, his administration, Democrats in the United States Senate, to ensure that we pass the For the People Act and the John Lewis Voting Rights Act that will protect democracy, voting rights, and the ability for people to participate. If we have a level playing field, Carlos, I am confident that Democrats win this state. I think we can still win it, even against these obstacles and this voter suppression. It's just a lot harder, and it's going to take a little bit longer.
Beto, you've spoken about some of the things that have been successes in the first 100 days of the Biden presidency, but I want to ask about another issue, an issue that, as a congressman from Texas, a border state, I know is dear to your own heart, and that's immigration. In March, 18,800 unaccompanied children crossed the border from Mexico into the United States. They're being held in overcrowded facilities. They don't have what they need. The sanitation is not always good. There is COVID in those facilities. It's hard to see how you would describe that as a success.
I don't know how to put this in terms of victories or losses or political points scored or lost. We're talking about human beings and the very vulnerable among our fellow human beings who have just traveled 2,000 miles on foot, in buses, atop trains, not inside of them, surviving all types of predators along the way to come to this country to seek refuge and shelter. Having said that, and acknowledging that the Trump administration dismantled many of the shelters and infrastructure that could take care of and house these families who are in such desperate need, given the fact that President Biden ended the Remain in Mexico policy, given the fact that he's trying to honor our asylum laws, I think he's moving in the right direction. But I'll also say this. I really wish that he would make the Americas, the hemisphere that we are in, his top foreign policy priority. The level of misery that we are seeing in the Northern Triangle of Central America is unmatched, a violent landscape in part made possible by what happens here in the United States, whether it is our demand for illegal drugs, whether it is the drug war that we have foisted on the rest of this hemisphere, whether it's the climate change disasters that they are trying to survive. And there's been no country that has contributed more to climate change than this country. So these families are doing what they've got to do. And I'll say this, under President Trump, and we saw significant spikes in northbound crossing attempts, especially in 2019 under his administration, but folks were still coming north. It's just that they were stopped and living in the most hellish refugee camps in Ciudad Juarez, in Tijuana, in Nuevo Laredo, and other places. We're not going to resolve this at the border, whether with walls or whether with Joe Biden's current policy. We will resolve this once we take the underlying causes for this outmigration seriously.
And Beto, how do you look at where the economy is? And what would you say to people, particularly young people, who perhaps would say, yes, the economy is doing better, but that's because, we're essentially using our credit cards as a country, that we are spending trillions that we don't have. How would you respond to that?
It's certainly in a lot better position than it was this time a year ago. We're obviously coming out of this pandemic. We've exceeded the goals set by President Biden for the number of doses administered. That is certainly injecting confidence into this economy and into the job market. So we're moving in the right direction. The real test, Carlos, I think is going to be in this $2.3 trillion jobs and infrastructure plan, which is also, of course, a main pillar of his climate strategy. If he can get this landmark legislation passed through both houses of Congress and signed into law, I think that's going to be fundamentally transformative to the American economy. I think over the long term, it's a very legitimate concern. In the short term, coming out of the deadliest pandemic of our lifetimes, the worst recession of our lifetimes, and the greatest set of global crises of the planet's lifetime, namely and chiefly among them, the climate, and the fact that money is so relatively cheap right now, the ability to borrow and fund these critically important programs, I think he's taking the right course. And if prosperity can be more equally shared in this country, if opportunity is more equally available, especially to those young people who want to know that they have a real future and real possibility in this country, that is going to do more than anything else to get our books balanced and to produce the kind of revenue and sustained growth that will allow us to pay down our debt and stop spending from a deficit position. It's not something that we can do immediately, and I think we need to meet the immediate challenges, which is going to require spending some money, but it is something over the long term, if we do the right things now, that we'll be able to solve for.
Beto, as we close, I want to talk a little bit about race. In your race for the Senate, you famously tackled issues of race and culture, if you will, as you talked about Colin Kaepernick's decision to protest police brutality and take a knee and some of the dissent and dissension that emerged. How have your conversations among primarily white Texans on matters of race, what does that look like over the last year as we've seen some of these conversations and protests take place?
A lot of these conversations center on the criminal justice system and policing in particular. There are, for example, 2 ballot initiatives in 2 big Texas cities right now. Proposition C in Austin, which would guarantee greater independent oversight of their police department, and Proposition B in San Antonio, which would do away with collective bargaining for police in a city that has the worst rate of rehire for police officers who have been fired from the force, in many cases for unjustified use of force against people of color. The other dynamic to this, Carlos, is our democracy. I mentioned earlier, we are the most voter-suppressed state in the country, the hardest one in which to vote. And that focus on voter suppression has been on Black and brown voters and voters in communities of color. I think many people, and not just people of color in the state of Texas, are recognizing that there's a link between the two. If you're not represented, if your vote is not cast and not counted, your voice is not heard, then you are not at the table, literally, when decisions are made about policing or criminal justice or access to health care or economic opportunity or the quality of your kids' schools. And so much of the focus right now is on trying to stop voter suppression that targets voters of color, and then at the same time trying to expand democracy at its moment of greatest peril. That's where so much of the conversation is right now. And I think so much of the action and the effort is focused. And it couldn't come at a better time because you've got two of the most suppressive voter suppression bills pending in the state legislature right now. And then in the United States Congress, you have the best opportunity since Lyndon Johnson's 1965 Voting Rights Act to protect and expand voting access for all eligible Americans. So that's where the conversation comes down to at this moment.
Beto, we can't let you go without asking about you. You told us at the beginning of this call as we were setting up that after this interview, you're going to go and teach a class, and then tonight you are going to go and work on a telephone bank to get out votes. What are your plans? There's a lot of speculation that you're eyeing a run for governor of Texas. Are you making plans for a re-entry into political life?
I'll tell you what, I'm focused right now on these two courses I'm teaching at Texas State and the LBJ school at UT. And then the work that I'm doing with a volunteer organization called Powered by People. And that's the phone bank that I'll help lead this evening, calling into Laredo, Texas, which has one of the worst rates of voter turnout, to talk to those voters now in 2021 and not wait until 2022 when we may be asking for their vote, and trying to help get many more people registered. That's going to be the focus for the foreseeable future. At some point, I will think about whether there's something more I can contribute politically and potentially as a candidate for office, but no plans to do that now, and really no time, at least until this semester finishes, to really think about it. So that's the focus for the time being.
Beto, thank you so much for joining us today. Really appreciate it. What an interesting moment to be having this conversation.
I'm grateful for the opportunity, and I wish the best for both of you.
Thank you, Beto.
Although Joe Biden won the presidency, Donald Trump got 10 million more votes than he did in 2016. So what are we likely to see from the Republican Party during Biden's time in office?
Joining us now is Jennifer Kearns, a Republican. She's a radio host, a political commentator, and a former Republican strategist. Jennifer served in the California government under Arnold Schwarzenegger, and she's been a spokeswoman for the California Republican Party. She says she is a fan of former President Trump and the majority of his policies. Jen, you've been listening into our conversation with Beto O'Rourke. What did you think of it?
I just, spoiler alert, I'm not running for president in 2024. Just want to get that out.
Oh, okay.
But very nice interview. I enjoyed listening in on that. You know, I thought it was a very honest conversation about the border crisis, which I think is no doubt Joe Biden's number one albatross around his neck at this point. What I think is interesting about Biden's first 100 days, if I may, is the approval ratings that are out this week. The fact that Joe Biden is polling at about 10 points below where his predecessor and former boss Barack Obama was at this point in his first 100 days is quite stunning. What I thought was interesting is that the two strongest polling numbers in Biden's favor were, number one, the vaccines, and number two, the economy bouncing back. Well, bouncing back to what? Bouncing back to the economy as it was under President Donald Trump. And you also look at the vaccines, and whether you're a fan of Donald Trump or not, and I understand many, many millions of people are not, Donald Trump could be credited for one thing, which is starting Operation Warp Speed last April 29th and really working and putting, $10 billion behind the production of the vaccines that now I think Joe Biden is getting credit for, because to the victor go the spoils.
Jen, I want to shift a little bit away from Biden for a moment to the Republican Party.
Sure.
Is this still Trump's party, or when I see Liz Cheney, the Republican Congresswoman and the number 3 Republican in the House of Representatives, are we beginning to see an evolution away from the former president?
Well, I think it remains to be seen. And I think a lot of that will depend upon what happens to Republicans in the midterms in 2022. I do think that Donald Trump still has a hold over the Republican base, in the same way that Sarah Palin had a hold over the Republican base after she was on the top of the ticket with John McCain. You might remember Sarah Palin for a good solid 18 months to 2 years. She was really the kingmaker. If people wanted to run for Congress or U.S. Senate, they would go to the Sarah Palin PAC to get the coveted endorsement. So I do think there is that sort of effect. We see people going down to Mar-a-Lago to have that photo op and to get that endorsement. But I think if the Trump endorsed candidates don't succeed in the 2022 elections, his star power will sort of dwindle. And I think that it will be at that point that Donald Trump himself will also think about whether he really has the juice to go on and run potentially again in 2024. There's no doubt about it, Carlos. He still has an incredible hold on the base. Whether or not that's good for the Republican Party, I don't think so in the long run. I don't know that those Trump-endorsed candidates are actually going to succeed in 2022, but time will tell.
Jen, you mentioned those polls, and when you dig down into them, there's actually a lot that Joe Biden is doing that is quite popular. Vaccine distribution, the spending on the stimulus bill, the infrastructure bill, they all get high approval ratings. If you were advising Mitch McConnell heading into the 2022 midterm elections, what would you advise him that his strategy should be?
I would focus on the policies that are really at the core of Joe Biden's soul and the things that he's putting forth. The largest spending program since FDR's era, 60% plus of American households still consider themselves fiscal conservatives. I would focus on those issues. I would focus on the issues that are far outside the mainstream of most American household values, things such as Joe Biden's gun control policies. Americans still cherish their Second Amendment rights to possess a firearm. And I think Joe Biden hits on that nerve with some of his policy proposals. I would also say some of the places that I think Joe Biden is actually getting pushed by the left wing of his party. He's being led down this path where they're promoting transgenderism. And if I were Republicans, I would focus on the out of control spending, and I would focus on some of those values that Joe Biden is pushing that are far too left, I think, even for Joe Biden. But I think he has to go there. He has to give some payback to the squad and some of the people that supported him and got him elected.
Jen, I want to turn you to 2024 a little bit, or even 2022. Should Republicans be playing up some of these cultural issues, whether we talk about questions of race, questions of gender? You hear this phrase now, woke. Is that a winning strategy, or is that something that Pat Buchanan and others tried 30 years ago and ultimately didn't prove successful for the party?
I do think it's a winning strategy. This woke war has now gone really to every household. 20, 30 years ago, when the right wingers, Pat Buchanan and the like, were pushing these issues, it really didn't trickle down to the average American household. But now you have people who have not been particularly politically engaged previously, but they're finding themselves banned on Facebook. They're finding that post they put on Twitter got taken down. The average American household now feels, and it's showing up in some of the polling, that there is a bias out there. And this was previously something that only really the elite political candidates could claim. This is only something, Donald Trump could pound on the desk about fake news and it was a great platitude. But now you have the American people actually at their own little computer, their iPad, their cell phone are now feeling that if they're not quite woke enough, that they are being squelched. That is a real, I think, shift in America that's happened in the last 4 or 5 months that hadn't happened in the last 40 years. And this is something I'm watching very closely in terms of the public perception out there of free speech and what people can talk about in the political discourse in America.
Jen, that is so interesting. In fact, I think when we come back after our break, I think that is a show that we should address. Jen Kearns, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you so much.
We hope you've enjoyed this series of When Katty Met Carlos, a co-production from the BBC World Service
and OZY Media. And if you've enjoyed this podcast, please leave us a review, tell a friend, and of course, don't forget to subscribe. Thank you, and we'll be back in late summer.